Welcome to Sleepy Love Tales, soothing romance for a restful night. If these stories help you unwind, be sure to subscribe. For now, close your eyes and let's begin tonight's story, The Silence Between Vows. The wedding was held on a Tuesday morning in March, with no one present but the vicar, his housekeeper, and a gardener called in from the grounds to serve as second witness. Catherine Hale, now Catherine Thornfield, stood in the dim nave of St. Michael's and listened to her own voice make promises she only half believed she would keep. The man beside her spoke his vows with the same studied neutrality one might employ when ordering coal. She'd expected more, not sentiment. She was too practical for that. But perhaps some acknowledgement of the peculiarity of their arrangement. Edmund Thornfield, however, seemed determined to treat the matter as he treated everything, with precision, economy, and an absolute absence of fanfare. When it was finished, he offered her his arm. His grip was firm, impersonal. They walked together into the pale spring light, and Catherine understood that this was how it would be. No romance, no pretense, simply an arrangement between two rational people who had each concluded that solitude was more expensive than compromise. The carriage ride to Ashwood was conducted in near silence. Catherine watched the countryside roll past, hedgerows giving way to open fields, and finally to the long gravel drive lined with chestnuts. The house, when it appeared, was exactly as she'd imagined it from his descriptions. A Georgian manor of moderate size, neither grand nor humble, its facade as carefully maintained as everything else in Edmund Thornfield's life. "Your rooms are in the east wing," he said as they descended. "Mine are in the west. Mrs. Croft will show you. Dinner is at 7. She nodded, and he disappeared into the house ahead of her, his boots clicking against the marble with metronomic regularity. That first evening Catherine ate alone. A note arrived just before 7, brief, apologetic in structure if not in feeling. Business in the greenhouse. She was not to wait. She read it twice, then folded it neatly and placed it beside her plate. The meal was excellent. The solitude was familiar. For 3 weeks this was the pattern. They met at breakfast, where he read correspondence and she reviewed proofs of her latest pamphlet, a sharp critique of property law that had already earned her the enmity of half the county. They exchanged pleasantries. Sometimes he asked about her work. She asked about the orchids. Neither inquired too deeply. But on the 22nd day of their marriage, something shifted. Catherine had gone to the library after breakfast, seeking a volume of parliamentary records. The door was ajar, and through it she saw him, standing before the window with a book open in his hands, though he was not reading. His posture was one of complete stillness, and his face, normally so carefully composed, wore an expression of such profound sorrow that she stopped in the doorway, unable to intrude. The moment passed. He closed the book, returned it to the shelf with his usual deliberation, and only then noticed her presence. "Mrs. Thornfield," he said, and she heard the effort it took to reassemble himself. "I did not expect you. Forgive me, I did not mean to disturb you." He gestured toward the shelves, an invitation to continue her search. But Catherine found she could not move, could not pretend she had not seen what she'd seen. "The book," she said carefully. "Was it?" "A volume of poetry, nothing of consequence." The lie sat between them, obvious and oddly vulnerable. "I see," she said, and meant it. She did see. She saw the careful architecture of his restraint and the weight it was built to contain. That evening he appeared at dinner. They spoke of the spring planting, the state of the roads, an article she'd read about education reform. The conversation was unremarkable, but when she rose to leave, he said, "The greenhouse is quite beautiful in the evening light. If you have any interest in horticulture, you would be welcome to visit." It was not quite an invitation. It was not quite an apology. It was, Catherine understood, an opening. The greenhouse became their territory. Catherine went first on a Thursday afternoon, when the light was slanting gold through the glass panes, and the air was thick with the scent of earth and growing things. Edmund was bent over a tray of seedlings, his sleeves rolled back, his hands, usually so clean and controlled, dark with soil. He looked up when she entered, but did not speak. She took this as permission and settled onto a bench near the door, a notebook in her lap. For a quarter of an hour neither acknowledged the other. Then he said, without turning, "The camellia near your left shoulder is diseased. You might move." She looked. The plant was beautiful, its leaves glossy and dark. "It appears healthy to me. Look at the underside of the third leaf from the top. You'll see the discoloration." She did. He was right. A faint mottling, barely, visible. "What will you do?" "Isolate it. Treat the soil. Wait. And if it does not recover?" He was quiet for a moment. "Then I will have learned what I could from the attempt." It was a small exchange, but Catherine found herself returning the next day, and the day after that. Sometimes they spoke. More often they simply existed in parallel, he with his plants, she with her writing. The silence was not uncomfortable. One afternoon in May, she asked him why he'd married. He was repotting a fern, his movements careful and exact. "The house required a mistress. I required," he paused, searching for the word, "order. And I provided that." "You provided the absence of disorder," he said, "which is not the same thing, but serves nearly as well." She should have been offended. Instead, she laughed. "I have been called many things, Mr. Thornfield, but the absence of disorder is perhaps the most accurate." He looked at her, then really looked, and something passed across his face. That might have been amusement. "I suspect," he said slowly, "that you contain a great deal of disorder. You have simply learned to direct it productively." The observation was so unexpected, so precise, that Catherine found herself without a response. She'd spent years cultivating the appearance of certainty, of rational control. To have it seen through so easily was both alarming and oddly exhilarating. That evening they dined together and spoke of politics. She argued for universal suffrage. He countered with concerns about literacy and education. Neither yielded. The debate grew heated, their voices rising, until Mrs. Croft appeared in the doorway with visible alarm. Edmund waved her away. "We're not quarrelling, Mrs. Croft. We're thinking aloud." When the housekeeper left, Catherine said, "You disagree with me, profoundly, and yet you continue to argue." "Because," he said, setting down his glass with unusual care, "your arguments force me to refine my own. I find the exercise valuable." It was the closest he had come to a compliment. Catherine felt something shift in her chest, a loosening of a constraint she had not known she carried. The summer brought heat and lengthening days. Catherine worked in the mornings, wrote furiously through the afternoons, and found herself drawn each evening to the greenhouse, where Edmund tended his plants with the patience of a man who understood that growth could not be rushed. They developed rituals. He would explain the properties of a particular species. She would relate some political absurdity from the newspapers. Sometimes their hands would brush as they both reached for the same volume in the library. Neither acknowledged these moments, but neither pulled away quickly. One evening in July, she found him standing before a particular orchid, his expression troubled. The plant was magnificent, white blooms so perfect they seemed artificial. It was hers, he said, before Catherine could ask. "My wife. My first wife." The word hung in the air between them. Catherine had known he was a widower. The settlement papers had made that clear. But he had never spoken of it, and she had not asked. "She died in childbirth," he continued, his voice careful and distant. "6 years ago. the child as well. I'm sorry. She liked to read poetry aloud, badly. She had no sense of metre whatsoever. He touched one of the blooms with a gentleness that made Catherine's throat tighten. I would give a great deal to hear her mangle Wordsworth one more time. Catherine understood then the silence, the precision, the careful maintenance of emotional distance. He had loved completely, and it had destroyed him. I will not ask that of you, he said, still not looking at her. I know what our arrangement is. I will not mistake it for something else. But Catherine found that she did not want to be an arrangement. She wanted... what? She hardly knew. Only that the careful distance between them had become unbearable. Edmund, she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name. He turned. Their eyes met. The moment stretched, taut and trembling. Then he stepped back, and the spell broke. Forgive me, he said. I should not have burdened you with this. It is not a burden. Good evening, Catherine. He left her standing among the orchids, her heart beating hard against her ribs, knowing that something had changed irrevocably. The autumn brought frost and the inevitable scandal. Catherine's latest pamphlet, a scathing indictment of inheritance law, had been printed and distributed before Edmund knew of its existence. The response was immediate and vicious. Anonymous letters arrived daily. The vicar called to express his concern. 2 neighbouring families withdrew their invitations. Edmund said nothing. His silence was worse than any rebuke. Catherine told herself she did not care. She had not married for social acceptance. She had married for independence, and independence she had. If her work made her husband uncomfortable, that was his limitation, not hers. But the distance between them grew. He stopped coming to dinner. She stopped visiting the greenhouse. They moved through the house like ghosts, aware of each other but unable or unwilling to speak. October arrived. The trees burned gold and red. Catherine worked with furious energy, writing letters and organising meetings. She told herself she was satisfied. She told herself she had everything she needed. But at night, alone in her rooms, she found herself listening for his footsteps in the hall. The breaking point came on a Tuesday evening in late October. Catherine had been working in the library when she heard voices in the hall, Edmund's low murmur and another man's sharp insistence. She recognised the second voice, Thomas Waverley, Edmund's solicitor and oldest friend. You must speak to her, Waverley was saying. The situation is untenable. She's making you a laughingstock. That is not your concern. Not my concern? Edmund, she is destroying your reputation. You should never have married a woman like that. Opinionated, unwomanly, she... Enough. The single word was quiet but absolute. Catherine froze, her hand on the door. My wife, Edmund continued, writes with clarity and courage on matters that most men are too comfortable to examine. If that makes her unwomanly, then I can only conclude that womanhood has been too narrowly defined. And if it makes me a laughingstock to be married to a woman of intelligence and principle, then I will wear that badge with considerably more pride than I have worn any honour bestowed by men who value reputation over truth. There was a long pause, then Waverley. I see. Forgive me. I had not realised. Good evening, Thomas. Catherine heard the front door close, then silence. She stood in the library, her heart pounding, and understood with sudden clarity that she had been a fool. His silence had not been disapproval. It had been respect. He had given her the freedom to write as she chose, to argue as she believed, and had asked nothing in return except that she allow him the same privacy he afforded her. And she, in her fear of being controlled, had mistaken his restraint for coldness. She found him in the greenhouse, as she knew she would. He was standing before the white orchid, his shoulders tense. I heard, she said. He didn't turn. I apologise. Waverley had no right. Why did you not tell me? Tell you what? That you defended me, that you... She stopped, struggling. That you believed in what I do. Now he did turn. His face was carefully blank. Would it have mattered? Yes, she said, and the word came out fiercer than she intended. Yes, it would have mattered. I believed you disapproved, that you thought me reckless, unwomanly. Something shifted in his expression. Catherine, I have spent 6 years learning to be silent, learning to keep the things I feel locked away where they cannot injure anyone. It has become... He paused, searching for words. It has become the only way I know how to exist. But it injures me, she said quietly. Your silence injures me, because I cannot read your mind, Edmund. I can only guess, and I have been guessing wrong. He closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were dark with something that might have been pain or might have been hope. What do you want from me? The truth, she said. Just the truth. The truth, Edmund said slowly, is that I married you because I believed we could coexist without complication. 2 people, each with their own pursuits, sharing a household and nothing more. Catherine felt something twist in her chest, but she held his gaze. The truth, he continued, is that within a month I realised I had been catastrophically wrong. You were not uncomplicated. You were infuriating and brilliant and entirely too observant. You asked questions I did not want to answer. You argued positions I knew to be right and made me doubt them anyway. You sat in my greenhouse and wrote words that would change minds, and I found myself watching you instead of my plants. He took a step closer. The air between them seemed to hum. The truth is that I am terrified, because I loved once completely and lost everything, and I swore I would not love again. But Catherine, his voice broke slightly, I find that vows made in grief are easier to speak than to keep. She could not breathe, could not think, could only stand there trembling as he closed the remaining distance between them. I have been silent, he said, because I did not trust myself to speak. Because once I began, I feared I would not be able to stop, that I would tell you everything, that I would say it, she whispered. His hand came up to cup her face, his touch gentle and sure. That I love you, that I have loved you since the day you told me my argument about land reform was internally inconsistent and then proceeded to dismantle it point by point. That I love your mind and your courage and the way you refuse to be anything other than exactly who you are. Catherine felt tears on her cheeks and did not care. I thought you married me for order. I married you for order, he agreed. I fell in love with you because you are magnificent chaos barely contained. She laughed, a broken sound, and then his mouth was on hers. The kiss was not gentle. It was 6 months of restraint breaking apart all at once, desperation and relief, and something deeper than either. His hands tangled in her hair. She pulled him closer, needing the solid reality of him, the proof that this was real. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, he pressed his forehead to hers. I should have told you, he said, months ago. I should have... Edmund. Yes? Stop talking. She kissed him again, and this time there was no hesitation, no careful restraint, only the two of them, finally honest, finally free. His hands moved to her waist, steadying her, claiming her. The greenhouse was warm around them, the air thick with the scent of earth and blooming things, and Catherine felt as though she were coming apart and being remade all at once. Catherine, he breathed against her mouth, and the way he said her name, rough with want, tender with wonder, made something inside her dissolve entirely. She pulled back just enough to meet his eyes. They were dark, pupils blown wide, and she saw in them the same desperate need that was coursing through her own veins. Take me inside, she said. Please. He needed no further invitation. His hand found hers, their fingers lacing together with an urgency that belied the careful distance they had maintained for so long. They moved through the darkened house like conspirators, past the library and the drawing room, up the stairs to the west wing where his chambers lay. The door closed behind them with a soft click. For a moment they simply stood there in the lamplight, facing each other. Catherine felt a flutter of nervousness. Not fear, but the profound awareness that this was a threshold from which there would be no return. "Are you certain?" Edmund asked, his voice low. Even now, even with desire written plainly across his face, he was giving her the choice. "I have never been more certain of anything," she said, and reached for the buttons at her collar. His hands covered hers, stilling them. "Let me," he murmured, and there was something in his voice, part request, part command, that made heat pool low in her belly. She let her hands fall away, watched as he undid each button with maddening slowness, his fingers steady despite the tension thrumming through him. The fabric parted, and she felt the cool air on her skin, followed immediately by the warmth of his touch. "You are extraordinary," he said softly, tracing the line of her collarbone. "I have thought so from the first moment I saw you argue with the vicar about tenant rights," she laughed breathlessly. "That is possibly the least romantic declaration I have ever heard. And yet it is the truth." His mouth found the hollow of her neck and she gasped. "I wanted you then. I have wanted you every day since." His words undid her more thoroughly than his hands ever could. Catherine pulled at his coat, his waistcoat, kneading the barrier of cloth gone between them. He helped her, shrugging out of the garments with an efficiency that would have been amusing in any other moment. When they finally came together, skin against skin, Catherine felt as though she'd been holding her breath for months and could only now exhale. He was warm and solid and real, and every careful fiction she'd constructed about what their marriage was crumbled to dust. Edmund guided her toward the bed, his movements careful but purposeful. He laid her down as though she were something precious, then stood for a moment simply looking at her. The intensity of his gaze should have made her self-conscious, but instead it made her feel powerful, desired, chosen. "Come here," she said, and he obeyed. The first touch of his bare skin against hers drew a sound from her throat that she'd never made before. His weight settled over her, grounding and electrifying all at once. She wrapped her arms around him, drawing him closer still until there was no space left between them. "Catherine," he murmured again, and she realized it was the only word he seemed capable of saying with any coherence. His hands mapped her body with the same careful attention he brought to his plants, learning, discovering, treasuring each response. When his fingers found the place where she ached most, she arched against him with a gasp. The sensation was overwhelming, pleasure so acute it bordered on pain. He watched her face as he touched her, learning what made her breath catch, what made her bite her lip, what made her say his name like a prayer. "Please," she managed, though she was not entirely certain what she was begging for. He understood anyway. His mouth found hers as he positioned himself above her, and when he finally entered her, they both went still. The feeling was foreign and familiar all at once, a joining that felt less like possession and more like completion. There was a moment of adjustment, her body accepting his, and then he began to move, slowly at first, with the same patience he brought to everything. But Catherine found she had no patience left. She lifted her hips to meet his, urging him deeper, faster, until the careful control he prized so highly began to fray. "Catherine!" Her name became a litany, a benediction, a surrender. She felt the tension coiling tighter and tighter within her, pleasure building to an impossible peak. His rhythm grew less measured, more desperate, and she gloried in the knowledge that she had brought him to this. had made him lose the careful restraint that defined him. "Look at me," he commanded, his voice rough. She opened her eyes and found his gaze locked on hers, dark and fierce and utterly present. "I want to see you." The intimacy of it, being seen, truly seen, in this moment of complete vulnerability, was what finally undid her. The pleasure crested and broke, washing through her in waves that left her trembling and gasping his name. She felt him follow moments later, his body shuddering against hers, his face buried in the curve of her neck. For a long moment neither of them moved. Catherine could feel the rapid beat of his heart against her chest, matching the frantic rhythm of her own. His breath was warm on her skin. The weight of him was perfect. Slowly, carefully, he shifted to lie beside her, gathering her against him. His hand traced idle patterns on her shoulder, and she realized with a small shock that he was trembling. "Edmund?" She turned to look at him, concerned. His eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Forgive me," he said quietly. "I had forgotten." He paused, struggling. "I had forgotten what it was to feel this much." Catherine's throat tightened. She touched his face, her thumb brushing away the single tear that had escaped. "There is nothing to forgive," she whispered. "Nothing at all." He caught her hand and pressed a kiss to her palm. "I love you," he said again, and this time the words came easily. "God help me, Catherine. I love you so much it terrifies me." "Then we shall be terrified together," she said, and kissed him softly. "Because I love you too, and I find I have no interest in safety anymore." They lay together in the warm darkness, limbs tangled, barriers finally and irrevocably breached. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. The greenhouse stood silent, its ordered rows bearing witness to the truth Edmund had known all along, that some growth cannot be controlled, only tended, and that love, once rooted, will bloom in its own time. Later, much later, they lay, together in his bed, the moonlight spilling through the windows in silver streams. Catherine's head rested on his chest, and she could hear the steady beat of his heart beneath her ear. "I was afraid," she said quietly. "All my life, I have argued because it was safer than being vulnerable. Easier to fight than to admit I wanted." She stopped. "Wanted what?" His fingers traced slow patterns on her shoulder. "To be chosen. Not for my utility or my silence, but for who I am. All of it. The arguments and the pamphlets and the stubborn refusal to be anything other than myself." He tipped her face up to his. In the moonlight his expression was tender. "Then you were chosen, Catherine. Entirely, irrevocably, with all your magnificent, infuriating, essential self." She kissed him, soft and slow, a promise in the gesture. "And you," she said against his mouth, "are you chosen as well?" "By you?" His smile was slow and real. "Always." Winter settled over Ashwood with unexpected gentleness. Catherine continued to write, and her words continued to provoke. But now, when the inevitable criticism arrived, Edmund read each letter aloud over breakfast, dissecting the arguments with the same precision he applied to botanical taxonomy. Together they composed responses, his measured, hers incendiary, the final version some negotiated middle ground that pleased neither but satisfied both. They didn't become a conventional couple. Edmund still spent hours in the greenhouse, and Catherine still kept irregular hours, writing through the night when inspiration struck. But now he brought her tea at 3 a.m. without comment, and she learned to recognize when his silence meant contemplation rather than distance. The white orchid bloomed in January, its flowers perfect and heartbreaking. Edmund stood before it one evening, Catherine beside him, and said, "She would have liked you, Helen. She would have argued with you constantly, and she would have adored you for it." Catherine took his hand. "Tell me about her." And he did. Not all at once, but gradually over weeks and months. Stories emerged in fragments. Helen's terrible singing voice, her habit of leaving books face down on every surface, the way she cried at weddings but never at funerals. Catherine listened and did not feel threatened, because she understood now. Edmund's capacity to love had not been exhausted. It had simply been waiting for permission to begin again. Spring arrived, and with it, the first signs of new growth in the greenhouse. Edmund was propagating a particularly difficult hybrid when Catherine appeared with a letter in hand. "I've been invited to speak," she said, "in London, at a symposium on legal reform." He looked up, soil on his hands, pride clear in his expression. "When?" "May. 3 weeks in total, possibly 4. Then we should leave in April. You'll need time to prepare, and I have always wanted to show you the botanical gardens at Kew." Catherine blinked. "We?" He set down his trowel and came to her, taking her face in his hands despite the dirt. "Did you imagine I would let you go alone? Catherine, I intend to sit in the front row and watch you dismantle every comfortable assumption in that room. And then I intend to take you to dinner and tell you how magnificent you were." She laughed, sudden and bright. "You'll be bored senseless." "Impossible. I find you endlessly fascinating even when you're wrong." "I am never wrong." "You were wrong about the camellia. You thought it was healthy." That was observation, not argument. Entirely different category of error. He kissed her, stopping the debate before it could properly begin. When he pulled back, he was smiling, that rare, genuine smile that still made her chest tighten. "I love you," he said simply. The words still felt new, still carried weight, but Catherine no longer feared them. "I love you too," she said, "even though you're impossible." "We're both impossible," he corrected. "It is perhaps our greatest compatibility." That evening, as the light faded to dusk, they worked side by side in the greenhouse. Catherine was proofreading her speech, and Edmund was tending to the new hybrid. The silence between them was comfortable, familiar, full of the 1,000 small intimacies they had built together. Outside, the world continued its complicated turning. There would be more scandals, more arguments, more difficult seasons. But here, in this moment, there was only peace. The silence between vows, Catherine thought, was not emptiness. It was the space where love grew quietly, rooted deep, learning patience, and bloom it would, in its own time, in its own way, irrevocably. The end. The voice between us. The air in the archival basement held its breath. Emma Wolfe had learned to work in silence, the kind that settled between heartbeats, that made the scratch of her restoration tools sound like thunder against the perpetual hush. Temperature, 65 degrees. Humidity, 40%. Light, minimal. Everything calibrated for preservation, for keeping the dead from crumbling further into dust. Down here, 3 stories beneath the university library, time moved differently. Slower, more reverent. Emma had been restoring early 20th century recordings for 4 years now, her days spent in the company of voices that no longer belonged to bodies, singing songs for audiences long turned to ash. She'd learned to treat sound as artifact, to separate the technical from the emotional, to hear a voice without imagining the throat that produced it. Until today. She lifted the shellac disc from its sleeve with gloved hands, noting the wear patterns, the slight warp near the centre. 1936. Unmarked. Someone, probably her predecessor, who'd had no patience for incomplete cataloguing, had labelled it simply as unidentified soprano, Vienna, Puccini aria. The kind of mystery that should have intrigued her professionally, but instead sat in the to-be-researched pile for months. She almost hadn't played it. Had a dozen other restorations waiting, each with proper provenance, each with actual historical value. But the sleeve was beautiful, Art Nouveau flowers fading into brown paper, and she'd been curious about the weight of it, the way it sat heavy in her hands like grief. Emma placed the disc on the turntable, set the needle with the precision of surgery, adjusted the horn's angle for optimal acoustics. She'd performed this ritual thousands of times. It should have felt routine. But the moment the needle found its groove and the voice emerged from the gramophone's brass throat, Emma knew. The voice was imperfect, breath audible between phrases, vibrato barely controlled, a hairline crack in the upper register where the soprano pushed too hard, wanted too much. Technically, it shouldn't move anyone. Technically, by every measure of professional training Emma had received, it was flawed. But Emma's hands stopped moving. The cotton swab she'd been using to clean another disc fell from her fingers, rolled across the workbench, dropped to the floor. She didn't notice. She knew this voice. Had heard it hum absently over breakfast tea, murmur recipes in German while kneading bread, go abruptly silent when memory pressed too close. For 26 years she'd lived with a grandmother who spoke little and sang never, who seemed to prefer the company of books to people, restraint to revelation, who wore silence like other women wore pearls. But this was her grandmother's voice, 50 years younger, unguarded, singing Tosca's desperate prayer, as though she believed someone was listening, as though love might be returned simply for being offered, as though the future hadn't yet taught her that some things once given could never be reclaimed. Vici date, vici d'amore, the voice sang. I lived for art, I lived for love. The past tense felt like prophecy. Emma played it again and again. By the fourth repetition, she'd stopped pretending she was doing restoration work and admitted she was eavesdropping on a version of her grandmother she'd never been allowed to meet. That evening, Emma climbed the 3 flights to her grandmother's apartment with the unmarked sleeve in her bag and her heart performing arrhythmias. The building was pre-war, with radiators that clanked like percussion and hallways that smelled of cabbage and old carpet. Helene had lived here for 40 years, in the same rent-controlled 2-bedroom with the same furniture Emma remembered from childhood. Everything precisely placed, nothing excessive, each object earning its space through utility or beauty. Helene Wolfe sat by the window with her usual tea in her usual chair, spine straight as a blade, hands folded in her lap like a prayer no one would answer. At 73 she remained handsome rather than beautiful, her face all elegant bones and discipline. She wore her silver hair in a bun so severe it looked painful. Her posture suggested a woman who'd learned young that to bend was to break, so she'd simply stopped bending. She looked up when Emma entered, and something in her granddaughter's face must have signalled danger, because she set down the book she'd been reading, Rilke in German, always Rilke, without marking her place. I found something today. Emma didn't sit, couldn't sit. She felt like she was confessing to a crime, though she couldn't name which one. A recording from Vienna, 1936. Helene's teacup paused halfway to her lips. The pause lasted 3 seconds, which was 2 seconds longer than necessary. 2 seconds during which Emma could see her grandmother calculating what to admit, what to deny, what truths could survive exposure to air. Did you? Not a question. Helene's voice remained steady, but her hand trembled microscopically against the china. Tea rippled like a seismograph detecting distant earthquakes. The singer used a false name, or no name at all. Emma waited, watching her grandmother's face for cracks. But I know your voice, Omar. I've known it my entire life. It's you. The cup completed its journey. Helen drank, swallowed, set the china down with the precision of someone who'd learned to control everything but her past. When she finally met Emma's eyes, there was no denial in her face, only a stillness so complete it felt like confession, like the moment before a building collapses when all the weight shifts and everyone inside knows but cannot yet move. "What do you want to know?" Helene asked. "Everything," Emma thought. "Why you stopped? Why you never told me? Why you fled Vienna? Who was listening when you sang like that? Who taught you to sound like your heart was breaking in 3/4 time?" But what she said was, "Why does it sound like you're singing to someone who can't answer?" Helene's mouth softened at the corners. Not quite a smile, too knowing for grief, too ancient for mere sadness. Her eyes went distant, focusing on something 50 years past and an ocean away. Because I was. The restoration became Emma's obsession, though she pretended otherwise. She told herself it was professional curiosity, a musicological puzzle, a mystery of attribution that needed solving. She submitted paperwork requesting extended access to specialised equipment. She drafted research proposals about anonymous Vienna performers. She created elaborate spreadsheets of plausible matches. But nights found her hunched over the workbench long after her colleagues had gone home, headphones pressed to her ears until they ached, learning to hear what lay beneath the notes, learning to hear her grandmother as a stranger, as a woman, as someone who'd once been young enough to believe in happy endings. Between the phrases she heard breath, not the controlled breathing of professional technique, but something more raw, more desperate. In the vibrato, hesitation. The aria was Puccini, Visidate, Tosca's prayer before she murders the man who would rape her. But her grandmother sang it like a question no deity would answer, like a woman asking why love and devotion must guarantee suffering, why purity of heart cannot protect against pain. Emma began to notice things a casual listener would miss, how the tempo pulled against itself, as though the singer wanted both to rush forward toward some imagined resolution and to linger in these last moments of not yet knowing. How certain words received more air, more weight. Visidate, I lived for art. Visi d'amore, I lived for love. Non feci mai male ad anima viva. I never hurt a living soul. The past tense mattered. The defensive tone mattered more. On her third visit to her grandmother's apartment, each one scheduled now, formal, Emma bringing pastries from the Austrian bakery, Helene pretended not to care about but always ate. Helene started talking. I was nobody, she said, stirring sugar into tea with methodical precision. Daughter of a watchmaker in Graz. He fixed timepieces for people who could afford to care about minutes. Voice lessons paid for by a patron who heard me sing in church and thought I had potential worth investing in. I had technique but no connections, no name that mattered, no family with money or influence. So when the Staatsoper offered me small roles, walk-ons, understudies, chorus work, I took them. I was grateful. Do you understand? Actually grateful to scrub floors in exchange for the chance to sing Carmen Cigarette Girls. And the alias? Protection. For him, primarily, but also for myself. Helene's fingers traced the rim of her teacup, around and around, a gesture. So unconscious, Emma wondered how many thousands of times she'd performed it, working anxiety into porcelain. In Vienna, reputation was currency. A soprano who sang well and behaved properly might advance, might catch the eye of important directors, might be invited to auditions that mattered. A soprano who loved unwisely would disappear, not dramatically, not with scandal, just quietly. No more roles, no more recommendations. The opera world is small, Emma. Everyone knows everyone. Shame travels faster than talent. Emma heard the edit in that sentence, the word scandal replaced with something softer, the way you learn to talk around old wounds. Who was he? The conductor. Helene said it without hesitation. as though the secret had been aging so long in silence it no longer stung to speak aloud, as though after 50 years the statute of limitations on heartbreak had finally expired. Maximilian Adler. Everyone called him Max. Married, prominent, Jewish, though this was 1935, 1936, and such things weren't yet openly dangerous the way they would become. He conducted with the precision of a mathematician and the heart of a poet, which shouldn't be possible but was. I fell in love with his hands first, how they shaped silence into meaning, how they could make an orchestra breathe as one body. Emma tried to picture it, her grandmother young, in love, singing night after night for a man who couldn't claim her, couldn't even applaud her without revealing too much. Did he know? Oh, he knew. Helene's smile turned rueful. Music doesn't lie, Emma. You cannot sing Puccini for a man and pretend indifference. Every rehearsal was a conversation we couldn't have in words. Every performance was a love letter I couldn't send. The intimacy of it struck Emma physical. How desire could live entirely in the space between baton and breath, between his direction and her voice. How two people could be lovers without ever touching. Did you ever kiss him? Helene asked. Almost. Once. After a particularly successful Tosca, I'd sung better than I ever knew I could. Found notes I didn't know I possessed, sustained phrases that should have been impossible. The audience wouldn't stop applauding. 14 curtain calls, flowers covering the stage. The director was ecstatic, already talking about extending my contract. She paused, poured more tea with hands that still, after all these years, knew exactly how to avoid trembling. But all I could think was that Max had pulled that performance from me, had conducted me into transcendence. I'd watched his hands all night, followed every gesture, every subtle shift in tempo, and somehow he'd made me more than I was. That's what a great conductor does. He doesn't just lead, he transforms. What happened after? We were alone in the rehearsal room. The orchestra had packed up and left. The stage crew was striking sets, but the music wing was empty. We stood in this bubble of aftermath, both of us still trembling with adrenaline, with the memory of what we'd just created together. Helene's eyes closed, and Emma knew she was seeing it again. Not remembering, but actually seeing, the way trauma stays vivid but joy fades unless you tend it. He stood close enough that I could smell the pomade in his hair, bay rum, old-fashioned even then. Could see where he'd cut himself shaving that morning. There was a tiny piece of tissue paper still stuck to his jaw, brown with dried blood. I wanted to remove it, wanted to touch him so badly my hands actually ached. Did you? No, but I wanted to. God, how I wanted to. His hand came up. She demonstrated, palm hovering beside her own face, fingers extended but not quite making contact. He was going to cut my cheek. I could see the intention in his body, the way his weight shifted forward, and I knew if he touched me, I would lean into it, would turn my face into his palm, would cross whatever boundary we'd been maintaining between professional and personal. So what stopped you? He did. His hand just stopped, hung there in the air between us, close enough that I could feel the heat of his skin across the gap, could hear his breathing change, deepen. We stood there for what felt like hours, but was probably 30 seconds. Time does strange things when you're that close to something you want but can't have. Then what? Someone applauded from the balcony, one of the cleaning staff who'd stayed late to watch rehearsal, an old woman, probably 60, 70. She'd seen the whole thing, or enough of it, and just like that, we remembered where we were, who we were, what we couldn't be. Max dropped his hand, took 2 steps back, said, "Excellent work tonight, Fräulein Weber," in this perfectly professional voice, and walked away. Did he look back? No, neither of us did. Looking back would have been acknowledgement, and we couldn't afford that. How long did this go on? Season. Autumn through spring. September 1935 to May 1936. Helene's voice went distant, as though reading dates from a ledger that had been locked away for decades. 8 months of singing with a man who heard me more clearly than anyone ever has before or since. 8 months of being known in a way that had nothing to do with words. She refilled both their teacups, though neither had finished the first pour. That was the real intimacy, you understand. Not touch, but recognition. He knew my voice better than I knew it myself. Could tell from the first warm-up note of rehearsal whether I'd slept well the night before, whether I was happy, whether I was thinking of him. And I could read him through his conducting. Desire in the tempo he set, always slightly faster when he was agitated, when he'd been thinking about me. Frustration in how hard he struck the downbeat. Longing in the spaces he left between movements, the silences that lasted one beat too long. You never talked. About it? Once. Only once. It was December, snowing. Vienna was beautiful in that way that makes you forget about politics and danger. We were in his office after everyone had left. He was marking scores and I was supposed to be leaving, but I lingered. Finally he said, without looking up, "This cannot continue." What did you say? I said I know, because I did know. We both knew. It was unsustainable, this thing we were doing. This almost love, this maybe affair that existed only in music. But knowing something should end and being able to end it are two different things. So it continued. For 5 more months, through Christmas, I spent it alone in my boarding room, imagining him with Eva and her family. Through carnival season, when the whole city pretended to be happy. Through Lent, when we sang more sacred music and I had to pretend Handel's passion settings weren't about the agony of unconsummated love. And then came March, the Anschluss. Everything changed. Emma waited. This was the part of history she knew from textbooks, but she'd never considered how her grandmother had lived through it, what it had meant personally. The Nazis marched in on March 12th. Within days, Jewish musicians were being dismissed. Max got his notice on March 15th. He had 2 weeks to settle his affairs and leave the country. The Philharmonic, this orchestra he'd built, musicians he'd trained, they just let him go. Some of them had been his friends. They gave him a farewell dinner, shook his hand, wished him well, and went back to work under new management. Her voice had gone flat, factual, as though emotion would complicate the telling. He came to find me 3 days before he was supposed to leave for London, asked me to come with him, said he'd leave Eva with a family. They had money, connections, she'd be safe. We could go to London together, to America, anywhere. He said, "I love you" for the first time out loud after 8 months of saying it, through music. What did you say? I said no. Emma found the conductor's name in a margin note on a score tucked inside the recording sleeve. For H, you sang like you understood. Signed, M. Adler, Maximilian Adler. She found him in the Vienna Philharmonic archives, conductor from 1933 to 1938, when he fled to London ahead of the Anschluss. Married to Eva Adler, née Blumenthal, daughter of a prominent banking family. No children. Emma brought the score to her grandmother's apartment on a Thursday evening. Helene took it in her hands like it might detonate. "You knew Eva," Emma said. It wasn't a question. Everyone knew Eva. Helene's thumb traced the margin note. Beautiful, intelligent, fragile in ways that weren't visible until you looked closely. Her family had already lost one daughter to melancholy, the kind that ends in bathtubs and opened veins. Eva was delicate. The marriage protected her in multiple ways. Did she know about you? I don't know. Max never said. But I think, yes. I think she knew and chose to say nothing because the alternative was worse. Helene set the score down carefully. He loved her, Emma. Not the way he loved me, perhaps, but love nonetheless. He loved her gently, protectively, the way you love something precious that might break. And you? I loved recklessly, completely, the way you love when you're 23 and believe desire alone can remake the world. Helene's laugh was soft, bitter. He asked me to leave with him in March of 1938, when it became clear what was coming. He said we could go to London, to America, anywhere. He would leave Eva with her family's money and protections. We would be free. But you didn't go. No. Why? Helene stood, walked to the window. Outside, rain had started. The kind of thin, persistent rain that made the city look like a memory of itself. Because Eva would have died, she said finally. Not metaphorically, not eventually. Within the year, I think. And Max would have known it was our fault. Mine and his, and that knowledge would have poisoned everything we built together. Love cannot survive that kind of blood. Emma felt something shift in her chest, a recalibration of what she thought was a romance into something more complex, more devastating. Did you tell him that? I told him I wouldn't be the reason he became a man who could abandon his wife to her death, that some loves cannot be consummated without destroying what makes them worth having. Helen turned from the window. He wept. I'd never seen him weep before. Then he kissed me, once, on the forehead, like a benediction, and left. And the recording, made the week before, he wanted something to remember me by. I wanted something to remember who I'd been when I could still choose love over survival. The weight of that sentence settled over the room like snow. 3 weeks after learning about Eva, after understanding the full architecture of her grandmother's sacrifice, Emma confronted the question she'd been avoiding. Why had Helene given up music entirely? Not just the false name, not just Vienna, not just Max Adler, but singing itself. The voice that had moved audiences, that had made a man willing to remake his entire life. She found Helene in the small shared garden behind the apartment building, deadheading roses with surgical precision. It was early September, the air carrying that particular combination of warmth and melancholy that comes just before autumn. Helene wore gardening gloves and her usual cardigan despite the heat, as though she needed armour even against flowers. "Tell me about the last time you saw him," Emma said without preamble. Helene's hands stilled on the shears. A bloom, half dead, hung suspended from her fingers. She didn't turn around. "I wondered when you'd ask that question. Was it the night you made the recording?" "No, that was professional, formal. We both knew we were creating an artifact, preserving something that was already past tense." Helene set down the shears with deliberate care, removed her gloves finger by finger. The last time was 3 days before he left Vienna, April 10th, 1938. I remember because it was a Sunday, and the churches were full of people praying for things prayer couldn't fix anymore. The weather was unseasonably warm, spring pretending summer would last forever. She sat down on the garden bench, and Emma sat beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. He came to my apartment, my boarding room really. One room, shared bath down the hall, the kind of place where ambition lives before it either succeeds or starves. We'd never been alone there before. It felt dangerous, improper, exposing. But propriety seemed absurd given what we were about to lose. Helene's voice dropped, became almost private, the way you speak when confession requires quiet. He stood in my doorway and said, "One night, give me one night, to remember when I'm old and you're a stranger." And I knew what he was asking, not for comfort, not for conquest, for the right to hold one perfect thing before letting it go forever. Emma held her breath, afraid that speaking would break whatever spell was allowing her grandmother to finally tell this. So I let him in. The garden seemed to lean closer, the roses bending as if to listen. We didn't speak much at first. Words would have made it negotiable, conditional, subject to second thoughts we couldn't afford. Instead, we moved like we were still in the opera house, him conducting, me responding, both of us performing the most important scene of our lives. Helene's hands clasped in her lap, and Emma saw they were trembling, as though the memory still had physical weight. He touched me the way he conducted, precisely, reverently, as though I were music made flesh. Started with my face, traced my cheekbones, my jaw, the line of my neck, memorizing, then my hands, turning them over, examining my fingers, the way they curved and rested. Beautiful, he said. Just that one word. Beautiful. Emma felt heat rise in her own chest. Not embarrassment, but recognition. This was what love looked like when it finally found its body after months of pure restraint. I'd thought intimacy was knowing someone's mind, understanding their thoughts, Helen continued. But that night I learned it's also knowing someone's body, how they breathe when desperate, what sounds they make when careful control finally breaks. He undressed me slowly, his hands learning the geography of skin the way his ears had learned my voice. Every touch felt like permission granted, like a question answered yes. She paused, choosing her words with care. We made love on my narrow bed with the window open and Vienna's spring air cooling our skin. He moved inside me like he was trying to memorize the rhythm, and I found myself singing, actually singing, soft and wordless, against his shoulder. Not performance, not technique, just pure sound, pure feeling. Afterwards we lay tangled together, his hand over my heart, feeling it slow back to normal. Helene opened her eyes, looked at Emma directly. This, he said, this is what I'll remember. Not the fear, not the leaving, this. And I knew he was right. We'd taken one perfect thing from a world determined to destroy us, and we'd made it ours. No regime could take that. No distance could erase it. Did he stay the night? Until dawn. We didn't sleep much. Mostly we talked. Actually talked. For the first time without codes or music. He told me about growing up in Munich, about the first time he heard Mahler and realised sound could be architecture. I told him about singing in my father's watch shop, how the ticking used to drive me mad until I learned to use it as rhythm. She smiled, and it was genuine. When the sun came up, he got dressed, kissed me once, properly this time deeply, then he walked to the door and said, "If there's a recording someday, will you listen and remember I loved you?" And I said yes. And he left. I watched him from the window until he turned the corner. He didn't look back. We'd agreed he wouldn't. "And you never sang again." Helene smiled. A real smile this time, sad but not broken. I sang that night. For him. With him. In a way that had nothing to do with audiences or applause. That felt like enough. Emma understood then. Her grandmother hadn't given up music. She'd transformed it, made it private, made it holy. What happened to Eva? She survived. Max got her to London, then to New York. I heard through mutual acquaintances that she lived until 1965, longer than anyone expected. They never divorced. He never remarried after she died. I think he kept his promise to her, in his way. And you? I came to America, changed my name. Helene instead of Helena, Wolf instead of Weber. Learned to be ordinary, married your grandfather because he was kind and didn't ask about my past. Raised your mother, raised you, lived quietly. She picked up the shears again, returned to the roses. But sometimes, late at night, I'll hum that aria, and I'm 23 again, singing for a man who heard everything I meant. That doesn't fade, Emma. Love like that doesn't diminish with age. It just becomes part of your architecture. Emma spent 2 months restoring the recording to the best fidelity 1936 technology and 2025 digital restoration could achieve. She removed surface noise, balanced the frequencies, brought her grandmother's voice forward from the static. But she left in the breath, the hesitation, the places where emotion fractured technique. Those imperfections were the truth. She presented it to Helene on a Sunday morning, in the garden where roses bloomed despite the late season. The recording was now digitized, remastered, saved to a simple USB drive. "I'm going to archive this properly," Emma said. "Not under your false name, not as unidentified, as Helene Wolf, née Weber, soprano, Vienna, 1936. "No," Helene said gently. "Keep the alias. That woman, Helena Stern, she belongs to that moment, to him. Let her remain there." Emma understood. Some loves were too large to be filed correctly, too private to be made public record. "Then I'll file it as anonymous soprano, Vienna 1936, rare recording, and I'll put in the notes that it's technically imperfect but emotionally devastating." Helene laughed, a real laugh, bright and unexpected. "Emotionally devastating. Yes, I like that." They sat together in the garden, two women separated by decades but connected by understanding. Emma thought about all the loves that never made it into history books, all the intimacies preserved only in silence and memory. "Do you regret it?" she asked, "not going with him?" Helene considered this with the seriousness it deserved. "No, because the love I had with Max was perfect, precisely because we didn't try to make it domestic. It stayed wild, immediate, untested by years and arguments and the small erosions of daily life. We got to love each other at our best. That's rare. But you gave up so much. I gave up one future for another. I gained your mother, you, this garden, a life that was mine, not borrowed or stolen. That's not nothing." Emma reached for her grandmother's hand, the same hand that once gestured so precisely on stage, that later kneaded bread and braided hair, and held her when she cried. "Thank you for telling me. Thank you for asking," Helene squeezed back, "and for understanding that some stories take a lifetime to be ready for telling." That afternoon, Emma returned to the archive. She catalogued the recording with its anonymous designation, filed it in the temperature-controlled vault where fragile things were kept safe from decay. But she also made a copy, unofficial, unmarked. She gave it to Helene on her 80th birthday, along with a small, expensive record player. "In case you ever want to hear yourself young again," Emma said. Helene accepted it with hands that trembled slightly. Age, not emotion. That night, alone in her apartment with a cup of tea going cold on the side table, Helene played the recording once. Just once. Her younger self sang Tosca's prayer with desperate, imperfect beauty, asking why love and art must hurt so much, why devotion guarantees suffering, why giving everything still isn't enough. She listened to the end, to where the orchestra swelled and her voice climbed towards something transcendent despite the technical flaws. Then she turned off the player and sat in the dark, remembering not the opera house with its velvet and gilt, not the audience with their applause and flowers, but a small boarding room in Vienna with spring air coming through the window and a man's hand over her heart, counting her pulse like it was the only music that mattered. "This is what I'll remember," he'd said. "Not the fear, not the leaving. This." And sitting there in the dark, 80 years old and alone but not lonely, joints aching with the ordinary betrayals of age, Helene realised he'd been right. Some loves don't need completion to be perfect. Some intimacies don't require possession to be real. Some music sounds better for being imperfect, for showing the breadth and effort and humanity behind the notes. The recording existed, flawed, anonymous, filed away where almost no one would ever hear it. The memory existed, private, perfect, preserved not in shellac but in the architecture of her bones. The garden bloomed outside her window, roses she'd planted, tended, dead-headed season after season, making beauty out of the ordinary work of living. Her granddaughter knew her story now, not all of it perhaps, but enough to understand that silence isn't always weakness, that some loves survive precisely because they were chosen, consciously and devastatingly chosen. That was enough, more than enough. It was everything. And somewhere across an ocean and 50 years she imagined Max Adler, long dead now, his hands that once shaped sound stilled forever, had thought so too, had kept his one perfect night as she had kept hers, had lived a good life, a kind life, a life that honoured both his promises, the one he made to Eva at an altar, and the one he made to Helena in a shabby boarding room with spring air cooling their skin. Some loves, Helen thought, you carry in your chest like a second heartbeat, and that's exactly where they belong. The end.